Hi, welcome to the latest Industry Insights episode. I'm here with my friend and colleague Jason Buffington. Jason, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Hey, very good. Another beautiful day in the information age. So we want to kind of continue on with the discussions we've been having now. And this time we're going to focus on Act Two. And Jason, why don't you tee up what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so Act Two typically is this concept of so you've done this one great thing, and now we're going to move on to something else. And to really appreciate that, let's put the Veeam stuff aside for a minute and talk about how the industry has evolved over the last. Well, you and I have actually been doing this for 30 years each. So if we can bring the graphic up, let's talk about how the industry has actually changed overall. Now, Dave, I use this as a generic icon for mainframe, but you actually know what this is, don't you?
Yeah, this is very near and dear to my heart. That's a IBM 3480 tape library. Where I live in Tucson, Arizona, the at that time multi-thousand person plant was developed just for that device, meaning they designed the heads there, the automation, they made the tape there. It's a cartridge that basically looked like this, although this is actually a ET Atari cartridge. It was a little bit bigger than that, but it is very, very similar to, whoops, let me get the glare out. This is actually considered but the worst video game of all time, so it's kind of a collector's item. But it's a what you showed is very, very reminiscent of the mainframe world and still actively used today.
Yeah. So if we bring the graphic back up, so when I first started, most of my first jobs were actually moving data off of mid-range and mainframe class systems and pulling them onto NetWare. Right. This was the late 80s, early 90s. And the whole idea was we were moving to PC servers and racked infrastructure in a more modern time. And then so that was mid 80s. Fast forward 6 or 8 years, and we went into Windows, where again, we were still in that rack and stack 2U, 4U, as many servers as you can stick in a rack kind of mode. And let's just kind of pause for a second. The idea in both of those models was that when I got done pulling all that data off of those mid-ranges and mainframes and got into NetWare, the presumption was you wouldn't be running mid-range in your environment anymore. And then few years later, I moved that data from NetWare to Windows, and the presumption was you wouldn't be running any more NetWare anymore. You'd just be running into Windows, right? We can take that graphic one step forward, though, because then fast forward another 10 years, and we saw that people went from physical servers into virtual, right? And this is really where Veeam comes into the picture. A little plug there, but VMware was and certainly probably is still king. Hyper-V came in as well about the same time, and then your questions were around Linux and Windows within that infrastructure. But that's the world that we find ourselves today. And just like in times past, there was something of an aspiration that when you were done embracing virtualization, you wouldn't have any physical servers left in the world. But Dave, what I think is interesting about that model is we do still have physical servers left in the world. And by the way,
Yeah.
we do still have mid-ranges and mainframes left in the world. We never left any of those. We may have downsized and deprecated as we invested in the new platform, but those old ones never go away because they're still creating business value even today, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I think we kind of teed that up a little bit in our cloud data management discussion, defining what that is. And we talked about, where organizations are today in terms of on-prem physical and virtual and cloud aspiration, how that looks to shift out in the next coming years. But it's certainly not a case that people decommission and
Right.
just absolutely turn off things. And one could argue now in current, economic conditions that people are going to hang on to gear for longer periods of time, especially to your point, if it's serving a good, valid business function. There's no reason to introduce risk, to introduce that extra spend. Now, directionally, I don't think anyone's going to argue where we're headed as an industry,
Right.
but it would be premature to kind of think that things happen in discrete chunks. It's really a continuum, and that continuum isn't a value statement. It's not good, better, best, even more bester. It's really just a case of, that's right, it's a case of right tool, right task, right? And
Yep.
so from a Veeam perspective, what we do in product strategy and product management is decide where we're going to focus, what makes sense strategically, while certainly still understanding that organizations, at least for some period of time, are going to be on various other systems, legacy systems as well. And by the way, legacy is not meant as a value judgment, as a negative in this context anyway.
Fair enough. But that's mostly just because you love mainframe so much. But that's a different conversation. Now, one thing we should also talk about though is that every time that we've seen over these last 3 decades a major platform shift, we've also seen a shift in how data protection gets done. Right. So the technologies that were great for protecting mainframe and mid-range are not the technologies that you use when you backed up NetWare. Right. In fact, when I first started, so in NetWare, it was ArcServe before, when it was Cheyenne, when it was CA, not the ArcServe you know today, and then Palindrome. Like nobody knows that name anymore, but at the time those were the two leaders, right? And then when we shifted from NetWare to Windows, those were not the two innovative vendors that were the disruptors or the leading innovators in data protection when it came to Windows, right? So there it was, well, backup exec, because Windows NT backup was a subset of that, and then Commvault was another one that was really big in the Windows time period as well. And then again, as we move from physical to virtual, same secret sauce doesn't carry again. You got to figure that out again. That's actually when Veeam came to the picture, right? So, and by the way, we weren't the only virtualization specific technology.
That's
VRAID
right.
and HD were there too, right?
Yep.
They got sold off for their IP years ago. And then Veeam continues in that space. Dave, let's talk about, what does it take to be a disruptor in data protection versus why is it that that the let's call it the legacy backup vendors of whatever the generations before weren't able to maintain that innovation?
Yeah, in some cases, you could use the phrase right place, right time. In some cases, our co-founder, Ratmir Timashev, likes to say that you don't actually have to be first. And there's some evidence to say you may not actually want to be first. You may want to just be in time. And Microsoft is a good example. If you think about virtualization, if you think about web browsers, certainly databases, et cetera, they weren't necessarily first, but they certainly have capitalized on the market. So part of what it takes is a pretty laser focused commitment. And it takes a great deal of understanding about what customers actually want. In that case, customers in a disruptive event may not actually know what they want. And I'll use a non kind of computer analogy where years after Sony introduced the Walkman, the Sony chairman was asked, how did you decide to make that bet? What led you to understand that the market would demand this? And he said there was no market. There was no notion of portable music devices. We just felt like if we built this, people would gravitate towards it. So in some cases, you have to anticipate.
Yes.
In other cases, after you make an anticipatory bet, to round out that feature set, you have to sort of let it seed in place for a period of time and let people utilize it and understand what will be best to extend and enhance the value of it.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I always found interesting, and this was especially colored by my years as an analyst when I was watching all the data protection vendors, because and I'd love to hear if you saw similar things back when you were over at Gartner. But I would often find that when I was talking to a data protection vendor and I could tell them this platform's coming, you really ought to be thinking about this platform. It ought to be main stage. Or are you at least thinking about how to develop for that platform? And the honest answer I would get from some of them is we are too busy focusing on our existing customers. We have quarterly revenue targets. We have quarterly investments. We can't deviate from that. We have to delight our existing install base. And so there wasn't enough budget and enough vision and commitment left to innovate for what was coming next. And then fast forward 5 years and somehow they're surprised they don't have a product in market that landed for that next platform. So I think there is something around the balance of, while you are currently delighting the customers that you have to be innovating and thinking about what is it going to take different for that next platform. Did you see something similar?
Yeah, I did. And before I double down on that, I just want to remind the audience, feel free to ask any questions in chat. We do have folks that are feeding them over to us, and we'll try to answer as many as we can, either online right now or after the fact. But I did, and it's a bit of innovator's dilemma, right? If you only focus on those that are purchased from you already, That on the one hand can sound like a very reasonable business model initially, but you have to ask yourself, do you ultimately start to self-limit? Meaning, do you go into more and more of a niche kind of a focus? And so the bet that you have to make is, while trying to preserve the needs of who you've already engaged with, is what's really the direction of where the market's going, the overall opportunity, and have some frank self-assessment. Are we as a provider, able to go and address that or not? And so I think how we see some of the vendors start to lose share. So just last week, IDC came out with their latest software tracker numbers, and you've got a case now 14 years in a row. The market share leader in backup and recovery remains the market share leader and continues to lose market share. And most of their activity from a financial perspective is really based upon renewals from existing customers. And so that's a very different growth pattern than someone that's actively engaging new customers going into new markets. So that's part of the shift.
Yeah. You could also argue that, when you think about, and there's not a single recipe, otherwise, everybody would do it exactly the
Right.
same
If
way.
it was easy, we wouldn't get paid.
That's right. That's right. There is something to be said for what is your long-term strategy, right? So if your long-term strategy is to cash out, then you come up with a widget and then you get as much revenue as you can on that widget. And you're not really thinking about innovating for the innovator's dilemma or the next wave, because really all you need to do is capitalize on the revenue that you've got and try to cash out. As opposed to, if you're really building this as a long-term business, you want to be a dominator for more than one generation, then you do have to be thinking multi-generational as far as how you're actually going to be developing the technologies that go behind that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And if we flip this around from the other perspective, meaning if you were evaluating as a data center professional who you want to partner with or the multiple providers that you look to partner with, I think you've got to pick where's your intercept, meaning what do I have today? What platforms, in other words, do I have? And maybe we still do have things like NetWare iSeries or something else that you're still adding value, but directionally, you're probably headed towards more virtualization on-prem if you're not already 90+% virtualized, directionally more to multitude of cloud environments. I'll let you kind of enumerate some of those, maybe not exhaustively, but as we've talked about in the past, there is not a single sort of cloud direction. But we know from our own research and just from what we see from prospects and current customers that the shift is on to the cloud. Certainly current world events might be driving people to consider more software as a service and things of that nature. So from a data center professional, if you're an IT administrator, if you're a manager of people focusing on this, I think you've got to look at who is really going in the direction that aligns not only with where I think we may be wanting to take our data center, but who's going to get there in the same time frame.
Yeah, let's go ahead and bring that last part of the graphic back up and finish the picture out. So, where most organizations find themselves over the last 3 or 4 years is, for many data centers, we're just now getting done with the IT modernization on-prem, right? For most of us, the average data center, what are we, 85, 88% virtualized on average. Progressives are over 90, laggards are somewhere under 70. But for the most part, we are virtualization first within the data center, except where physical infrastructure still matters. Where we find most of ourselves today, Dave, as you mentioned, is it's a very cloudy world, right? So now we see a bevy of clouds, and here's just a few, and we just grabbed a few logos for fun. But I think there's something else from a data protection perspective that we want to be mindful of, and that is that every time that there was a primary platform shift, there tended to be that one hero scenario in data protection that if you built for this, you are relevant for that time frame. Right. So when it was NetWare, the key scenario that was disruptive was to actually bolt the tape drive to the NetWare server. Everybody else, you put the tape drive on a workstation, logged in as admin, and you pulled the data out. When it was Windows, the best of breed was around embracing VSS, right, and actually being able to sequester the databases or quiesce them in a consistent way. In the virtualization data center, it was how well can you back up VMs, and oh, by the way, embracing dedupe as a storage array. That was the hero scenario. The problem with clouds is that the way that you protect Amazon is different than the way that you back up Azure, is different than the way you back up Office 365, is different than the way you back up Google. So all of a sudden, there's not a single secret sauce that says, okay, if you do this one thing, you're going to be a data protection leader in the cloudy world. In this case, that innovation has to happen in parallel, not in serial, and that's something we haven't seen in this industry before.
Yeah, and it goes back to that. This is not discrete. This is a series of and options, meaning few organizations will have every one of these, but
Correct.
many organizations at various times anyway, at various implementation stages, will have multitude of these capabilities. And I liked your analogy around if you think about a play or a musical that have different acts, you get from act one to act two, that implies a finality that's not really the case in this instance.
Yeah, so that's where I like to poke a little fun in Act Two. I mean, if we were to look at that industry chart, we'd say we're in Act Four, right? So there was, or maybe it's Act Three, depends on how you count it. So there's the mainframe era, then there was the PC server era, then there was the virtualization era, and now we're in the hybrid multi-cloud era. So IT wise, I guess it's the fourth inning. We'll use some baseball as opposed to theater, right? So, and it's not about ignoring what happened before. I'm a baseball guy, right? And we should be playing games this time of year. And so I keep thinking about when we hear Act One and Act Two, I keep thinking about going to a batter, Act One, and saying, hey, loved all the batting you're doing, but you're not going to bat anymore. You're just going to catch. That's only your job. And that's actually not how that works, right? You have an example of it's not a change, it's an expand.
Yeah, I think we're currently getting groceries delivered,
Mhm.
and whenever we like put in our requests, they you can either say like give me exactly what I've asked for or nothing else, or you can say, well, feel free to give me some different options. Well, some of the different options that have shown up on our doorstep have been, instead of asparagus and broccoli, we've gotten Brussels sprouts and kale. And so I tried kind of steaming that, and that was pretty gross. Then I threw it on the grill, and I thought, hey, this is not so bad. So even when I go back to a time frame when I can get all of my options fulfilled, I really view what we're in the my current reality is going to be an expanded menu of choices. And I
Yep.
think that's kind of the same here. It's not like suddenly I'll just go back to only doing what I was doing before. It's I'll make decisions on what seems most appropriate, and I'll have a broader palette to draw from.
So yesterday was Sunday for me, and I just can't imagine going to my Sunday school class and teaching them, hey, we're going to ignore the Old Testament and we're only going to focus on the New Testament, right? It doesn't work like that. And so that's another one. And then what would your wife say to if we only did no more core work, only do cardio or only do resistance?
Yeah. From a exercise perspective, there's a really good technologist. I think I don't want to misquote. I'll attribute Fred Moore, and his notion is you don't go to the gym once. And he likens that to digital transformation, meaning it's a process. And to your analogy, you just don't do one thing to the exclusion of another. Like I'm only going to do core work versus cardio. I'm only going to do upper body versus lower body. It's
Yep.
it's it's a mix, and I think increasingly, the mix that we're referring to here, to your point, it's different. There's similar outcomes, but the
Yes.
implementation and how you derive and get to best practices results can be very, very different. And that's where, when we think about Act Two as a vendor, it's different in the sense that it's not like what we've experienced on prem. We want the same levels of availability. We want the same levels of ease of use. Certainly you have to have financial options and licensing flexibility, but how you derive that in Azure, AWS, from software as a service, infrastructure as a service, as your point, is very, very different than what we might get out of AHV or physical Linux, et cetera, on-prem today.
Yeah, so we talk about how in these videos, the first 15 or so minutes, we want to be really mindful of the industry, and then on the back, let's be unapologetically. Let's talk about Veeam for a minute. So let's go ahead and bring up the graphic on how we respond to Act Two or inning number four or the third wave or whatever you want to call it. But this is the Veeam Cloud Data Management Platform, and certainly most folks know us for backup and replication. Of course, we put storage APIs underneath to access the underlying mechanisms. We put orchestration and monitoring and analytics above, but notice those 4 boxes as equal citizens within this architecture of not just virtualization that we're known for on the right-hand side, but certainly also physical service, because we said those weren't going away,
Yep.
right? And then different kinds of clouds, including cloud-hosted infrastructure on the far left, and then SaaS-based, another way to consume cloud-based services. In fact, if we click one more time, we can kind of expand that out and really understand. So Act 2, if we were in Act 1, you'd have to just basically look only at that right edge, right? It's just for VMware, by the way, pretty darn good for Hyper-V and Nutanix as well, and it's just backup. But that's not our Act 2. Our Act 2 is about providing those same kinds of outcomes, same kind of customer relationships, same kind of integration below the covers, but do that for a much broader range so that we are in that parallel relevance for the cloudy, hybrid, multi-world, and not just best for VMware.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I was tweeting this weekend back and forth with someone. I liked the comment, and the individual said, best practices are changing. And I thought, and his comment was across the data center. It wasn't specific to backup or even to storage. And I kind of thought about it and then tweeted back, I'll politely give you a different view on that, which is in storage and particularly availability. I could argue best practices have remained best practices for 35 years. And you could give any number of variety, like you want to have more than 2 copies of your backups. It would be nice to test your availability plan. Storage management concepts of abstract pool resources and apply policy to them. That's been going on from mainframe through VMware, et cetera.
Oh, yeah.
So those things still remain in place, but the challenge, of course, with best practices is fewer and fewer of us may be following those. But when you and I chatted about this, ironically, just last week, I think you had a good comment around best practices may be remaining consistent. And to your point on that slide we saw, whether it was sort of what we're calling Act 1 or Act 2 workloads, you still want those data services to be very consistent. But you had a good point about what's the challenge? What changed in the environment to make best practices a little more difficult?
Well, often it's the administrator, right? So, you look at those last waves that we saw, the folks that, the reason that you and I can talk about this 30 years later is because we've been in the data center for most of 30 years. Right now, maybe not living there every day, but when you went from mainframe to PC-based servers, it was the same folks for the most part that were on that raised floor, and you transitioned over time. So things like you got to back your stuff up, you got to do role-based controls, you got to actually have physical proximity security. I mean, there's some basic block and tackle that still landed. Even when we went from physical to virtual, we had a little bit of a gap because the vAdmin didn't necessarily was a PC admin before. So they had to learn a little bit, but there was still an assumption. As we go into cloud, we're seeing a lot of environments, large corporate enterprises that are not, the people that are running those clouds don't necessarily come from an IT pedigree. You were sharing a story when David Hill went to KubeCon. You want to share it or shall I?
Go ahead. Yeah, it's a great one. I like it.
Yeah, so this was an event entirely related to containers, right? And there were 3 breakout sessions on backup, and 2 of them were mostly just talking about what backup is, not how to get it done, right? Now, the rest of us in IT, we know what backup is, but evidently some of the folks that were there don't. I would argue that if the world had just standardized on Windows Server 2003, SQL 05, Exchange 03, with Windows 7 or Windows 98 as your desktop, backup would be solved, right? But it's not, because not only does the administrator keep changing, but the primary platform to be protected changes as well. And between those two, my guess is you and I will continue to have a job for at least the next 10 years, maybe not the next 30.
Yeah, I like how you phrase that. And, not that you suggested this, but it used to be sort of fashionable, at least maybe 10 years ago, especially to say, well, there's the dumbing down of the administrator and things are changing. The reality is the landscape is changing. People are working really, really hard in some cases just to try to keep up because of everything we mentioned. We didn't commission the I-series. We still have on-prem and physical and virtual X, Y, and Z. We still have custom applications. We're trying to move to various incantations of what the cloud can be. So you're juggling a lot of balls. You're just trying to keep the business up and running. That makes for a bit of a challenge to say the least. So as we start to near end of time, and I liked how you ended on cloud.
Yep.
Veeam in particular has some cloud news that's happening really basically as we speak. Can you take us through some of that?
Yeah, so we talked about how every time there's a new platform, it takes a little while for the backup solutions to start innovating on that. At Microsoft Ignite back in November, we previewed Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure, right? So the folks at Microsoft Ignite were actually the first folks to see that. This week. It is in the marketplace, right? So folks can actually see that. I'm so excited for that because it means as you continue to move workloads, you are not going to go from well-protected workloads in the data center to unprotected workloads in a modern cloud. So folks, go check out the Azure Marketplace. And if you're new to Azure hosting, if you're new to backing that up, our good friend Rick Vanover, he's got some stuff he's going to be talking about for that, right?
Yeah, that's right. This Friday at noon Eastern, Rick is going to go through our Veeam backup for Azure, and that complements pre-existing Veeam backup for AWS
Yep.
capability. And our colleague David Hill, that we kind of gave a shout out to, the Cubicon attendee, he's also at this Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern. He and Sam Nichols are going to go through a live demonstration of that platform as well. I'll say one kind of last thing just to kind of harken back to how we kind of began this Industry Insight series. David Hill and I had a chat about portable data format, and that comes directly into play with what you just mentioned there in terms of being able to go on-prem to maybe AWS to Azure or back in any other direction and having a flexible solution to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, if you haven't gotten in the weeds to really understand how this stuff works, David Hill, Rick Vanover. In fact, we've got a whole technologist team, even the broader strategy team, that we're all gearing up to share all these different kinds of insights. We should go ahead and bring up the splash for Veeam on. Because you can actually hear from all of them, including a wide variety of topics on best practices on-prem, from deployment and architecture, troubleshooting, Azure, AWS, on-prem virtualization, physical, even a few flavors of Unix. I mean, we've got all of that coming up. So Veeam 2020, for those that hadn't heard, we are moving to an online format this year, June 17th and 18th. Registration is free, and you'll see the URL on the bottom of the screen. But all of us right now are getting our decks ready to start really sharing. Dave, you and I have one session together and then one session each apart. So lots more to share. Maybe in our next session, we can start to unpack some of the data, give folks a teaser on what we'll be doing in some of our talks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this one, thank you so much always, Jason. We really encourage everyone to take a good look at what's coming up this Friday in a
Mhm.
couple different formats, Veeam especially, and we look forward to joining you in the near future. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.